November 1939. Yokosuka Naval Base, Combined Fleet, Isoroku Yamamoto. Born in 1884 in Nagaoka, Niigata, Yamamoto had risen through the Imperial Navy's ranks, his left hand bearing the mark of Tsushima's 1905 battle, where he lost 2 fingers to shrapnel. By 1939, his career spanned fleet commands and staff roles, honed by a clarity few could match. His time in the United States had revealed a giant oil pipelines threading through Texas Plains shipyards in Virginia, resounding with the clang of rivets, and factories in Detroit poised to shift from cars to war machines. The number that matters is oil millions of barrels per day versus Japan's meager domestic trickle. He saw no path to outlast such capacity, no way to sustain a fleet across years of attrition. From 1919 to 1921, Yamamoto studied at Harvard, traveling widely across the United States, observing its financial systems, oil distribution networks, and sprawling industrial base. He noted the ease with which America moved resources, trains laden with steel tankers, heavy with fuel, all feeding a machine that could scale up without strain. This was not just wealth, it was capacity measured in output and logistics. Later, as naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, he watched U.S. shipbuilding up close yards, turning out destroyers and carriers at a pace Japan could not rival. Naval aviation was taking root with airfields expanding and pilots training in numbers that hinted at future dominance. The constraint was clear: America's industrial base could replace losses faster than Japan could inflict them. By 1930, at the London Naval Conference, Yamamoto's work with treaty ceilings and force ratios sharpened his view. Fleets were not just ships, they were extensions of industrial might and oil access. Japan's navy, for all its skill, rested on a narrow foundation, while America's grew from a bedrock of resources. He carried this lesson back to Tokyo, where he argued against war with the United States in the late 1930s. The tripartite pact binding Japan to Germany and Italy troubled him. It risked pulling Japan into a conflict it could not sustain. Yet, as national policy tilted toward war, his voice, though respected, could not shift the tide. In July 1941, Japan's move into southern French Indochina triggered a decisive response. On 26 July, the United States froze Japanese assets, and on 1 August, it halted oil exports to Japan. Pre-embargo Japan had relied on American petroleum for 80% of its supply. This cutoff turned fuel into a hard time limit, a clock ticking down to depletion. Yamamoto's forecast grew sharper. A long war was a strategic dead end. Fuel stocks were commonly estimated to cover roughly 18 months, give or take, without new sources. His realism was not defeatism, but a calculation grounded in what he had seen. Factories sprawling across American cities, oil fields stretching to the horizon, and shipyards ready to churn out fleets. He urged avoiding war if possible, but if ordered, he would strike first to seize the initiative. The rhythm of his thought was technical, unswayed by rhetoric. Japan could fight fiercely for 6 to 12 months, but beyond that, the numbers, oil, steel, and ships would dictate the outcome. Yamamoto's clarity came from years immersed in America's industrial pulse. From 1919 to 1921, he studied at Harvard not just English, but the machinery of a nation. He traveled its rail lines, watched oil tankers unload at coastal ports, and stood in factory yards where steel was shaped with relentless efficiency. America's output was staggering, about 3 to 4 million barrels of oil daily on the eve of war, enough to fuel fleets on a scale Japan could not match. He saw workers shift seamlessly between tasks, a flexibility Japan's rigid systems lacked. This was not mere wealth, it was capacity to sustain war. His notes from those years were precise, filled with figures on production rates and logistics chains. As naval attaché in Washington from 1926 to 1928, Yamamoto observed shipyards up close. Destroyers often moved from keel laying to commissioning in under a year. Carriers required far longer, but the pipeline never stopped. Naval aviation was no longer experimental. Airfields dotted the coast, training pilots at a pace Japan could not match. American industry could bring new carriers into service at a steady rhythm due to parallel builds, even though individual construction commonly exceeded a year. Japan's shipyards, constrained by steel and skilled labor, lagged far behind. He reported these observations to Tokyo, each dispatch a warning a long war would grind Japan down. The London Naval Conference of 1930 sharpened his perspective further. Treaty limits on ship tonnage forced him to think in ratios fleets as extensions of industrial bases. America's oil and steel production underpinned its naval power, while Japan's dependence on imports left it vulnerable. He argued this point in staff meetings, his voice steady but urgent: avoid war with the United States. Yet as Japan's leaders leaned toward the tripartite pact, his counsel was sidelined. Standing on Yokosuka's deck, Yamamoto traced the horizon, knowing Japan's fleet could strike with precision but not endure a grinding war. American shipyards could bring escort carriers into service on an almost monthly rhythm thanks to parallel production, whereas fleet carriers Essex-class each required well over a year to complete. Japan's large carriers typically took years. His plan, if war became inevitable, was a short, decisive campaign to create a narrow window for victory, before America's production overwhelmed Japan's resources. He had measured the United States, its oil, steel, and shipbuilding, and found it unyielding. The cold truth was simple: Japan's fuel reserves would burn out on the order of 18 months under wartime demands. Back in Japan, Yamamoto's position was clear: if war came, strike first to gain 6 to 12 months of advantage. American pilots trained in thousands annually. Japan's elite system, reliant on limited fuel and instructors, could not scale. He saw the mismatch in replacement rates: ships, planes, crews, and new time favored the United States. His plan hinged on a bold opening to disrupt America's Pacific Fleet, buying time for Japan to negotiate from strength. American radar and air warning systems matured quickly from late 1941 into 1942, increasingly blunting surprise. This was his cold calculus. Japan's window would close as America's industrial machine roared to life. The oil embargo of August 1941 turned Yamamoto's warning into a deadline. Japan's pre-war dependence on American petroleum, 80% of its supply, meant fuel stocks were often estimated at roughly 18 months under wartime strain. The number that matters is oil without new sources. Japan's carriers, destroyers, and aircraft would grind to a halt by early 1943. Yamamoto's strategy became a race against this clock. Seizing oil fields in Southeast Asia was critical, but holding them required a navy stretched thin across vast Pacific distances. He calculated ranges a Zero fighter's practical combat radius was long for its class. But even with ferry range exceeding 1,000 miles, it remained limited by fuel for sustained operations, and logistics would decide tempo. Yamamoto's realism shaped his argument within Japan's high command. War with the United States should be avoided. If unavoidable, it must be swift. He envisioned a crippling first strike targeting the Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor to delay America's counteroffensive. This was conditional realism, not despair. His plan rested on what he had measured. American shipyards could bring new carriers into service at a steady rhythm due to parallel builds, even though individual construction commonly exceeded a year, while Japan's took years on a narrower base. A short war might force a settlement before the United States mobilized its full strength. Japan's fleet could sortie at high rates initially, but fuel and crew losses would erode this edge. The industrial gap was stark. America's steel production dwarfed Japan's, churning out enough to build dozens of ships annually. Aircraft manufacturing followed suit. By 1942, American factories were producing thousands of planes each month, while Japan struggled to replace hundreds. Pilot training was another choke point. America's programs scaled rapidly, producing thousands of pilots yearly without sacrificing standards. Japan's pre-war system built for elite aviators faltered under attrition. Fuel limits forced shorter training flights, reducing skill. After 1 year of war, Japan's experienced pilots would dwindle. Yamamoto's office in 1941 buzzed with plans, maps spread across tables showing Pacific islands and shipping lanes. He knew the United States would recover from an opening blow. Its oil output, about 3 to 4 million barrels daily on the eve of war, with capacity surging under mobilization, ensured sustained operations. Japan's hope lay in a narrow window strike, seize resources, and negotiate before America's industrial weight crushed them. American radar could give warning at 10s to over 100 miles depending on altitude and system shrinking surprise. He pushed for secrecy, speed, and precision, knowing the first 6 months would decide whether his gamble could succeed. The paradox took shape. Yamamoto, who had warned against war, now planned its opening. His years in America had shown him the enemy's strength, yet duty demanded he act. He crafted a strategy to exploit Japan's early edge, but the numbers haunted him. Fuel, steel, and trained crews would run short. The United States would not. His forecast held beyond 12 months. Japan's chances faded against an industrial tide. On December 7, 1941, Yamamoto's plan struck with precision across the Pacific, targeting the American Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. 6 Japanese carriers positioned about 230 nautical miles north of Oahu launched Zeros and bombers under dawn's cover, their strike well within that radius. Zeros with drop tanks had long ferry range, but combat radius, not headline range, at a set altitude governed the mission. The attack crippled battleships, sank destroyers, and cratered airfields, killing 2,403 Americans in hours. Yamamoto, aboard his flagship in Japan, awaited reports, knowing this blow bought time, 6 to 12 months before America's industrial might responded. The number that matters is oil. Japan's reserves, burning at wartime rates, would last on the order of 18 months without new fields. The strike's success was undeniable but incomplete. Carriers absent from Pearl Harbor escaped unscathed, preserving America's ability to project power. Yamamoto had anticipated this risk. His plan hinged on delaying, not destroying, the United States' counter-offensive. Japan's fleet surged south, seizing oil-rich territories in the Dutch East Indies by March 1942, temporarily easing the fuel crisis. But the clock ticked. American shipyards could bring new carriers into service at a steady rhythm thanks to parallel construction, though each hull typically took well over a year to complete. Japan's yards, limited by steel and labor, needed years. Yamamoto's strategy leaned on speed and surprise, exploiting Japan's early advantage in trained pilots and cohesive fleets. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese aviators executed with precision honed by years of elite training, yet attrition loomed. Japan's pilot pipeline, on the order of hundreds per year pre-war, struggled to expand beyond the low thousands, constrained by fuel and instructors. America's scaling rapidly trained many thousands annually, without compromising standards. By mid-1942, American radar could give warning at up to roughly 100 miles, depending on altitude and set, shrinking the element of surprise. This cold fact tightened the window Yamamoto had engineered. The plan's flaw emerged starkly. Early victories could not secure a lasting edge. Japan's conquests stretched its navy across vast ocean distances, burning fuel and exposing ships to counterattacks. The United States, undeterred, began mobilizing its industrial base. Factories were producing on the order of thousands of aircraft per month by late 1942, surging higher in 1943, while Japan struggled to replace hundreds. Steel production followed suit, with American yards launching new destroyers and carriers at a pace Japan could not match. Yamamoto's forecast, rooted in his American years, haunted the campaign. A long war favored the United States. Standing on his flagship's bridge, Yamamoto studied maps of the Pacific tracing routes to Midway and the Solomons. His gamble required more than tactical wins. It needed a decisive blow to force negotiations. But America's resilience was already evident. Shipyards worked around the clock. Oil fields pumped about 3 to 4 million barrels daily on the eve of war, rising under mobilization. Japan's early triumphs, though stunning, could not alter the industrial math. The window for decision was closing, just as he had warned. American training pipelines could bring pilots to wings in under a year. Japan's stretched thin faltered under losses. The tide, driven by numbers, began to turn against him. By June 1942, Yamamoto's short war strategy faced its first major test at Midway. He aimed to lure American carriers into a trap, sinking them to extend Japan's operational window. 4 Japanese carriers steamed toward the atoll, their flight decks crowded with strike groups whose combat radius, not headline ferry range, would govern the day. American codebreakers had uncovered the plan, and Midway's early warning net, including radar, gave notice at long range. The battle turned disastrous. 4 Japanese carriers were lost in the action, 3 in the morning, the 4th later, their experienced air crews swallowed by the Pacific. Japan's navy could not replace such losses quickly. The constraint was stark. Japan's shipyards needed years to replace a fleet carrier. America could bring new carriers into service at a steady rhythm thanks to parallel construction, though each hull typically took well over a year to complete. Steel output favored the United States by a wide margin. Midway exposed the flaw Yamamoto had foreseen. Early success could not outpace American recovery. His plan had banked on a 6 to 12-month advantage, but by mid-1942, the United States was already closing the gap. Factories were turning out on the order of thousands of aircraft per month by late 1942, surging much higher in 1943-44, while Japan struggled to replace hundreds. Pilot losses hurt more. Japan's training system, once elite, crumbled under fuel shortages and rushed schedules, producing on the order of low thousands per year at best. American schools produced many thousands annually while maintaining standards. Yamamoto's maps now showed a shrinking perimeter. Japan's conquests in the Dutch East Indies secured oil, but holding these territories stretched ships and crews thin. Fuel stocks, often estimated at roughly 18 months, burned faster under constant operations. American submarines began targeting tankers, tightening the noose. Yamamoto pushed for aggressive moves in the Solomons, hoping to disrupt Allied supply lines, but each sortie drained irreplaceable resources. American air search radar could give warning at 10s to roughly 100 miles, depending on altitude and set, and surface search sets reached out tens of miles, eroding tactical surprise. This cold reality, gnawed at his strategy detection, outpaced deception. The industrial mismatch grew undeniable. By late 1942, American shipyards were launching new destroyers and escort carriers monthly, while Japan struggled to repair damaged hulls. Fleet carriers, the backbone of Pacific warfare, took Japan years to replace, whereas the United States, with multiple keels laid in parallel, commissioned new carriers on a relentless cadence, even if each individual build still exceeded a year. Yamamoto's warnings from his American years echoed. The United States would dominate a long war through sheer output. His short war gamble, though bold, could not rewrite the numbers. Japan's pilots, once unmatched, dwindled as attrition outstripped training. On his flagship, Yamamoto recalculated his face lined with the weight of command. The Pacific's vastness, once Japan's ally, now exposed its limits. Oil fields in Texas and California fueled American fleets at roughly 3 to 4 million barrels daily on the eve of war, then rose under mobilization, while Japan rationed every gallon. The window he had planned for 6 to 12 months was closing. The American industry, which he had studied in 1919, now roared at full strength, just as he had predicted. The tide had turned not by chance, but by the relentless math of production and replacement. By early 1943, the Pacific War's trajectory confirmed Yamamoto's deepest fears. Japan's early victories, Pearl Harbor, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, had stretched its navy across thousands of miles, burning fuel and crews at unsustainable rates. Oil stocks, often estimated at roughly 18 months, dwindled faster as American submarines sank tankers. Japan's carriers reduced after Midway could not be replaced quickly. Shipyards lacked steel and skilled labor. America's yards commissioned new carriers on a steady cadence thanks to parallel construction, though each hull typically took well over a year to complete. The number that matters is oil. American output surged from the pre-war, 3-4 million barrels per day baseline, dwarfing Japan's captured supplies. Guadalcanal, fought through late 1942, bled Japan's air crews. Zeros could ferry long distances with drop tanks, but combat radius, not headline range, governed operations, and increasingly green pilots flew them. Japan's training pipeline, choked by fuel shortages, produced on the order of low thousands per year at best, many underprepared. American schools produced many thousands annually and could bring pilots to wings in under a year, scaling without collapsing standards. By mid-1942, American radar could give warning at 10s to roughly 100 miles depending on altitude and set, stripping away surprise. This cold fact sealed Japan's tactical decline. Stealth was no longer an option. Yamamoto's strategy unraveled as America's industrial might surged. By 1943, U.S. factories were turning out on the order of thousands of aircraft per month, rising further in 1944, overwhelming Japan's output of hundreds. Steel production followed the United States, forged enough for dozens of ships annually, while Japan struggled to patch damaged hulls. The Pacific Fleet, battered at Pearl Harbor, was reborn stronger, with new carriers and destroyers flooding the theater. Japan's navy, stretched across islands and shipping lanes, could not match this pace. Yamamoto's short war plan, designed to force a quick settlement, faltered as the United States refused to negotiate. On April 18, 1943, Yamamoto's plane, a Mitsubishi bomber, was ambushed over Bougainville in Operation Vengeance. American fighters, guided by cracked codes, shot it down, killing the architect of Japan's opening strike. His death marked no sudden shift. The war's course was already set. The industrial gap he had measured in 1919 now dictated the outcome. Japan's fuel reserves nearing exhaustion crippled operations. U.S. oil output, already in the multi-million barrel per day range pre-war and climbing under mobilization-powered fleets that pressed Japan's perimeter inward. The paradox of Yamamoto's vision endured. He had warned against a long war, knowing America's production would outlast Japan's. Yet duty had driven him to plan a desperate gamble, a swift campaign to delay the inevitable. His forecasts, grounded in oil and steel, proved true. By 1943, the United States replaced losses faster than Japan could inflict them. The window for decision, 6 to 12 months, had closed. Japan's navy, once formidable, now fought a losing battle against an industrial titan Yamamoto had measured and feared. By late 1943, the Pacific War had become a grinding attrition Japan could not sustain. American shipyards worked around the clock, commissioning new carriers on a steady cadence thanks to parallel construction, each fleet hull still taking well over a year, while escort carriers were rolling out on near-monthly rhythms. Japan's yards, starved of steel, managed a fleet carrier only over years. Oil, the lifeblood of naval operations, flowed at about 3 to 4 million barrels daily on the eve of war and rose under mobilization, while Japan's captured fields in the Dutch East Indies faltered under Allied attacks. Fuel stocks, often estimated at roughly 18 months, were nearly exhausted, forcing ships to idle and pilots to ration flights. The number that matters is oil. Without it, Japan's fleet was tethered to shrinking perimeters. The human cost mirrored the material. Japan's pilot training, once elite, collapsed under pressure. By 1943, output was on the order of low thousands per year. At best, many rushed into combat with minimal hours. American schools produced many thousands annually and could bring pilots to wings in under a year, their skills sharpened by abundant fuel and simulators. At Leyte Gulf in 1944, Japan's air crews, depleted of veterans, flew Zeros, whose long ferry ranges meant little combat radius, and fuel limits ruled every sortie into battles they could not win. American radar could give warning at 10s to roughly 100 miles, depending on altitude and set, guiding interceptors that shredded formations. The cold truth was unrelenting. Japan's losses outpaced its replacements. Yamamoto's death in April 1943 had removed the mind behind the short war strategy, but the war's trajectory followed his warnings. The United States, which he had studied in 1919, now wielded its industrial might without restraint. Steel production supported fleets that dominated the Pacific. Aircraft output surged on the order of thousands of aircraft per month by late 1942, higher still through 1943 and into 1944, overwhelming Japan's hundreds. The Solomons and Marianas fell, each loss shrinking Japan's reach. American submarines sank tankers, choking off oil supplies. Japan's navy, once a predator, became prey, its ships hunted across contracting sea lanes. The strategic flaw Yamamoto had feared was now reality. Early victories could not force a settlement. The United States, with its vast resources, refused to negotiate, instead pressing forward with new ships, planes, and crews. By 1944, Japan's carriers were shells, their decks empty of seasoned pilots. American fleets, swollen with replacements, pushed toward Japan's home islands. The industrial gap which Yamamoto had measured in America's factories and oil fields was insurmountable. His 6 to 12-month window had been a fleeting hope crushed by the numbers he knew too well. In the end, Yamamoto's realism, forged in Harvard's lecture halls and Washington's shipyards, proved prophetic. Japan's navy could not outlast the United States' relentless production. Oil, steel, and trained crews decided the war just as he had predicted. The Pacific, once a stage for Japan's triumphs, became a graveyard for its ambitions. The United States industrial tide, which Yamamoto had seen rising in 1919, swept away his nation's gamble, leaving only the cold math of defeat.